Star Wars didn't just change cinema, it shattered it completely. The moment that film crossed $1 billion, every studio on the planet lost its mind. Hollywood, Tokyo, Rome, even Turkey, everyone wanted their own Star Wars. And what came next was one of the wildest gold rushes in movie history. Dozens of films, some with massive budgets, some held together with duct tape and stolen footage, all chasing the same lightning bolt George Lucas had caught in 1977. Some of these movies launched the careers of future legends. One of them actually got sued by Lucas himself, and one of them, the one sitting at the very top of this list, didn't just copy Star Wars, it's the reason Star Wars exists at all. What people missed, and what nobody really talks about, is how these so-called 10 knockoffs were doing things that Star Wars itself never dared to try. This is not a list of failures. This is a list of 10 films that got buried under the shadow of the biggest franchise in history. Number 10. Star Odyssey, 1979. Between 1977 and 1979, Italian director Alfonso Brescia made 5 sci-fi films back-to-back. Yes, 5. Not because he loved the genre, but because Star Wars had just made $775 million worldwide, and every producer in Rome wanted a piece of that money. Brescia was their guy. He worked fast, he worked cheap, and he never said no to a paycheck. Star Odyssey was supposed to be the crown jewel of that run, his most ambitious project yet, the one that would finally compete with Hollywood. He shot the entire thing for roughly $300,000. The premise alone tells you everything. An alien warlord doesn't invade Earth, he buys it, at an intergalactic auction, like real estate. The heroes sent to save humanity include a psychic gambler, a retired space captain, and 2 robots who fall in love and try to end their own existence because they can't process the emotion. That subplot is played completely straight. The lightsaber fights were staged with fluorescent painted sticks that bend and wobble on every impact. Costumes were assembled from leftover Italian television wardrobes and discount stores across Rome. Several space helmets were motorcycle helmets wrapped in aluminum foil. The entire production ran on improvisation, desperation, and blind confidence. And here's the thing, when Star Odyssey opened, it made almost nothing theatrically. Italian audiences ignored it. International distribution companies barely looked its way. The film simply disappeared, buried under dozens of other late 70s sci-fi knockoffs fighting for the same audience. Brescia moved on to his next project without ever looking back. He genuinely believed he could match Star Wars with pocket change and passion. That delusional confidence gave the film a heartbeat that bigger, slicker copies completely lacked. Number 9. Starchaser, The Legend of Orin, 1985. Here's something that sounds completely made up but isn't. The same South Korean animation studio that produced the official Star Wars Droids cartoon for Lucasfilm also animated one of the most blatant Star Wars ripoffs ever made. Same artists, same desks, same building. One project had George Lucas's blessing. The other could have gotten them sued into oblivion. That film was Starchaser, The Legend of Orin, and the story behind it is wilder than anything that ended up on screen. Producer Stephen Hahn wanted to make history. His vision was the first animated feature to combine traditional hand-drawn animation with computer-generated imagery and release the whole thing in 3D. This wasn't some basement operation. The budget landed around $20 million. Meanwhile, Disney's The Black Cauldron was released same period and cost $44 million. Hahn was swinging at Disney with less than half their resources and 0 brand recognition. The plot borrowed so heavily from Star Wars, it practically needed a citation page. A young slave named Orin discovers a magical sword hilt buried underground. He escapes to the surface, meets a roguish smuggler with a fast ship, and joins a rebellion against an evil overlord who commands a massive army. On paper, the opening weekend for Starchaser should have been a celebration. The film launched on over 1,000 screens across North America. It made $3.3 million total. The 3D gimmick backfired because most theaters didn't have proper equipment to project it correctly. The film vanished almost overnight. No sequel, no merchandise line, no cultural footprint whatsoever. Han's dream of launching an animated sci-fi franchise died in its opening week. Number 8. Star Crash, 1978. Italian producer Nat Waxberger saw Star Wars in a theater in 1977 and reportedly turned to his partner before the credits even finished rolling and said, "We can do that." He couldn't. He then spent $4 million trying, and the result was Star Crash, a film so spectacularly misguided that it accidentally became one of the most entertaining sci-fi movies of the decade. Director Luigi Cozzi had a genuine love for science fiction. That was never the problem. The problem was everything else. The script was written in English by Italians who barely spoke the language. Filming bounced between Rome and various outdoor locations that were dressed up as alien planets using little more than colored lights and Christmas decorations. The stop-motion effects were handled by a single animator working essentially alone with no deadline extensions. And then there was the cast. Caroline Munro starred as Stella Star, wearing a leather bikini through the vacuum of space because, according to Cozzi, in the future, there is no cold. Plummer was reportedly paid $50,000 for roughly one afternoon of work and delivered every line reading the script off cue cards just out of frame. The film opened across Europe in 1978 and actually performed decently in Italy and France, pulling in modest returns against its budget. Everything about Star Crash was wrong, except the people who genuinely believed they were making something great. Number 7. Message from Space, 1978. George Lucas has always been open about one thing. Star Wars was built on the bones of Akira Kurosawa's samurai films. The Hidden Fortress gave him the structure. The Wandering Ronin became the Jedi. The katana became the lightsaber. Lucas took Japanese storytelling and wrapped it in American spectacle. So when Japan decided to make its own Star Wars, something deeply ironic happened. They were essentially copying a film that had already copied them. Toei, a Japanese company, produced Message from Space in early 1978 with a budget of roughly $6 million. At the time, that made it the most expensive Japanese film ever produced. For comparison, the average Japanese feature cost less than $1 million. Toei wasn't playing around. They wanted an international hit, something that could compete with Hollywood on its own turf. They hired Kinji Fukasaku to direct, and the result was visually unlike anything else in the Star Wars knockoff wave. It wasn't just copying Lucas, it was filtering Lucas back through the culture he originally borrowed from, creating a strange cinematic loop that nobody fully appreciated at the time. Message from Space opened. Box office returns were disappointing. Japanese audiences found it too Western. American audiences found it too Japanese. The New York Times reviewed it with the now famous line that it was so terrible it has a certain comic integrity. Toei never attempted anything this ambitious in the sci-fi genre again. But what people missed about Message from Space wasn't the quality, it was the poetry. A culture reclaiming its own stolen stories, dressed in someone else's costume, and somehow making something that felt entirely new. Number 6. The Ice Pirates, 1984. By 1984, the Star Wars ripoff wave had been rolling for 7 years. Studios had tried serious copies, cheap copies, animated copies, and foreign copies. Nobody had ever tried a funny copy. Then MGM greenlit The Ice Pirates, a sci-fi comedy about space pirates who steal the most valuable resource in the galaxy. Not gold, not weapons, but ice. Water had become so scarce across the universe that frozen blocks of it were worth more than any treasure. It was absurd. It was supposed to be. Director Stuart Raffle had a budget of roughly $9 million, which sounds reasonable until you realize he was trying to build an entire galactic civilization with that money.
I'm not the boss.
Sets were constructed at MGM's Culver City Studios using whatever was available from previous productions. Several corridors from other films were repainted and relabeled as spaceship interiors. Production was chaotic from the start. The script went through multiple rewrites during filming. Entire sequences were cut for budget reasons and replaced with cheaper alternatives. One infamous scene features a space herpes creature that was originally meant to be a terrifying alien parasite, but became a comedic blob because the effects team couldn't make it look convincing. The film opened to weak numbers and earned roughly $13 million worldwide against its $9 million budget. It should have disappeared forever. Instead, it became one of the most rented VHS tapes of the mid-80s. Number 5. The Last Starfighter, 1984. Every kid who ever played an arcade game in the 1980s had the same fantasy. What if the game was real? What if every high score was actually a test, and someone out there was watching, waiting for the right player to prove they were ready for something bigger? In 1984, a film took that exact fantasy and turned it into a movie. And what people don't realize is just how close The Last Starfighter came to never existing at all. Writer Jonathan Batwill had shopped this script around Hollywood for years. Nobody wanted it. Universal finally picked it up with a budget of around $15 million, but the real gamble wasn't the story. It was the technology. Director Nick Castle and producer Gary Adelson made the radical decision to replace almost every physical spaceship model with computer-generated imagery. This had barely been attempted before. A Cray XMP supercomputer, one of the most powerful machines on Earth at the time, was used to render 27 minutes of digital effects. Each frame took several hours to process. The entire CGI pipeline was essentially invented on the fly by Digital Productions, a small company operating out of Los Angeles with fewer than 50 employees. The Last Starfighter opened in July 1984 and earned $28.7 million domestically. Profitable, but not a blockbuster. In later years, the film's premise became a cultural blueprint. Ender's Game, Ready Player One, The Matrix, even elements of the Marvel Cinematic Universe owe something to the idea of The Last Starfighter. A sequel has been rumored for decades and keeps resurfacing every few years without materializing. The Last Starfighter didn't need a franchise. It planted a seed that grew into an entire genre, and that's something no amount of CGI can replicate. Number 4. Battle Beyond the Stars, 1980. Corman was Hollywood's ultimate opportunist. The man had produced over 300 films and never lost money on a single one. When Star Wars exploded, Corman didn't panic. He calculated. His pitch was simple. Take the plot of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, the same film Lucas had borrowed from, set it in space, and shoot the whole thing for $2 million. That budget was roughly 1/5 of what Star Wars cost. Corman didn't need to match Lucas. He needed to beat him to the profit margin. He hired novelist John Sayles, who would go on to become one of America's most respected independent filmmakers, to write the screenplay for a reported $15,000. The cast featured George Peppard, Robert Vaughn from The Magnificent Seven, and Sybil Danning. Richard Thomas from The Waltons took the lead as the young hero. Cameron was brought on as art director and model builder. His job was to create an entire galaxy on a shoestring. The female spaceship, named Nell, was deliberately designed with a curved body shape that resembled a woman's figure. Corman approved it immediately because he knew it would generate press. When the film opened, it grossed approximately $11 million against its $2 million budget. By Corman standards, that was a massive hit. 3 careers launched from that set. Cameron, Sayles, and composer James Horner all used Battle Beyond the Stars as their stepping stone to greatness. The most brilliant thing about this ripoff was never the movie itself. It was the people it created. Number 3. Turkish Star Wars, 1982. There is a film that exists in this world that did something no other production in cinema history has ever done before. It stole actual footage directly from Star Wars, edited it into its own movie, and released it in theaters. Not inspired by, not homage. Literal scenes from George Lucas's Star Wars cut into a completely different story with completely different actors pretending to exist inside that footage. The film is called Dünyayı Kurtaran Adam, which translates to The Man Who Saves the World. Everyone else just calls it Turkish Star Wars, and nothing can prepare you for what this movie actually is. Director Çetin İnanç had almost no budget. Estimates place the entire production cost at somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. Turkey's film industry in the early 1980s operated under an unwritten rule. International copyright law was virtually unenforceable, and filmmakers freely borrowed whatever they needed from foreign productions. Inanc didn't just borrow. He took entire sequences of X-Wing battles, Death Star explosions, and space panoramas directly from a 35mm print of Star Wars and spliced them into his film using rear projection and crude optical effects. He also lifted the music. John Williams's iconic score plays throughout the film, alongside themes stolen from Raiders of the Lost Ark, Flash Gordon, and even Battlestar Galactica. The hero, played by Turkish action star Cüneyt Arkın, defeats villains by strapping swords to his hands and punching through them. One scene shows Arkın literally ripping a monster in half with his bare hands. There are no special effects for these moments, just a man in a field destroying rubber costumes with raw physical force. The film was never released outside Turkey during its initial run. No international distributor would touch it for obvious legal reasons. It became a local curiosity and faded from memory. Number 2. Battlestar Galactica, 1978. George Lucas watched the first episode of Battlestar Galactica in September 1978 and saw his own movie staring back at him. A young hero on a desert world. A wise old commander leading a ragtag fleet. A cantina scene with alien musicians. An award ceremony finale. The similarities weren't subtle, and Lucas wasn't just annoyed, he was furious. Within weeks, 20th Century Fox filed a lawsuit against Universal Studios, alleging that Battlestar Galactica had stolen 34 distinct ideas from Star Wars. The complaint listed 13 specific scene-by-scene parallels that Fox argued went far beyond coincidence. But here's what made the situation explosive. Universal had hired John Dykstra to handle the show's visual effects. Dykstra wasn't just any effects artist. He had been the head of industrial light and magic during the production of Star Wars itself. Lucas had let Dykstra go after the film wrapped, and watching his former effects supervisor bring those same techniques to a competing production felt like a personal betrayal. The show's creator Glenn Larson maintained he had been developing the concept since the late 1960s under the title Adam's Arc, long before Star Wars existed. He pointed to early drafts and story treatments as proof. Universal countersued Fox, arguing that Star Wars itself had borrowed heavily from earlier sci-fi properties. The legal battle escalated all the way to the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Years of litigation, millions in legal fees on both sides. Meanwhile, the show itself was burning money at a terrifying rate. Each episode cost roughly $1 million to produce, making it the most expensive television series in history at that point. When both sides got settled in court, Battlestar Galactica's franchise went dormant for over 2 decades. Then, in 2004, Ronald D. Moore reimagined it into a serialized drama that became one of the most critically acclaimed sci-fi television series ever produced. A show that started as a rushed Star Wars clone ended up redefining what science fiction on television could be. Number 1. Flash Gordon, 1980. Before Star Wars, there was a young filmmaker named George Lucas sitting in a meeting trying to buy the rights to Flash Gordon. That meeting is where everything begins. Lucas loved the old Flash Gordon serials from the 1930s and 1940s. He wanted to remake them for a modern audience. He approached the rights holders. They turned him down. Being disappointed, Lucas went home and created his own space opera from scratch. He called it Star Wars, and the rest is history. But here's where the story folds back on itself. After Star Wars became the highest-grossing film of all time, Italian mega-producer Dino De Laurentiis finally secured the Flash Gordon rights and decided to make his own version. Not because he loved Flash Gordon, because he wanted to compete with the franchise that Flash Gordon had accidentally created. The budget landed at approximately $35 million. De Laurentiis hired British director Mike Hodges, the man behind Get Carter, and told him to make something spectacular. The cast was stacked. Max von Sydow played the villain Ming the Merciless with theatrical precision. Timothy Dalton, years before becoming James Bond, starred as Prince Baron. And then there was the soundtrack. De Laurentiis didn't hire a traditional film composer. He hired the Queen, the entire band. Freddie Mercury, Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon scored the film with one of the most iconic and recognizable soundtracks in cinema history. The theme song alone became bigger than the movie itself. Queen was reportedly paid around $250,000 for the entire score, a bargain that became priceless. Flash Gordon opened to roughly $27 million domestically against its $35 million budget. By studio standards, it underperformed. But in the UK and across Europe, Flash Gordon became a cultural institution. Decades later, it holds a devoted following that has never faded. Every single film on this list exists because of one rejected meeting. Flash Gordon didn't just inspire a ripoff, it inspired the original. And that might be the greatest plot twist in cinema history. If you made it this far, drop the movie that surprised you the most. And if there's a forgotten sci-fi gem you think belongs on a list like this, let us know in the comments. See you in the next video.